For as long as humanity has sailed the seas, the waters of our world have carried secrets. Sailors spoke of phantom lights, gods of the deep, and ships swallowed by mysteries no chart could explain. In the modern age, those same waters remain haunted, not by myth, but by objects that defy physics, caught on radar and witnessed by those sworn to defend the seas. Under modern names and old disguises, the same theatre repeats. Naval groups report objects that move like thought above deep water. Radar paints targets that cannot be reconciled with aircraft performance envelopes, and sensors at the very edge of our acoustic and electromagnetic understanding hint at transmedium incursions that begin or end in the sea. When the smoke clears, there are very few photographs, and many people who were told to forget what they saw, yet the pattern refuses to die. If you stack the chronology from the 1940s to the present without forcing it into a neat story, a meta-pattern emerges that is both simple and infuriating. The closer you get to deep water, trenches, ridges, and naval operating areas, the more frequently the anomalies appear. They are reported by pilots, radar operators, sonar technicians, coastal police, fishermen, and lighthouse keepers. They cluster around the Puerto Rico Trench, the Bermuda Triangle, the California Channel Islands, the Norwegian Sea, the South Atlantic, and the Southern Ocean. They interfere with instruments, blank radios, and sometimes drain the courage of witnesses who thought they were immune to fear. This is not just the testimony of sailors and radar operators, or the stories of those left awestruck by the unknown. It is a pattern acknowledged at the highest levels of military and scientific authority. Rear Admiral Dr. Tim Gallaudet is not only a retired flag officer in the United States Navy, he served as the Navy's chief oceanographer and commander of the Naval Meteorology and Oceanography Command, overseeing national security research at the frontiers of ocean and atmospheric science. He later became acting Undersecretary and Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere, and acting administrator and deputy administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the United States government's top scientific post for the world's oceans and climate. With a doctorate from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and decades leading both classified operations and civilian research, his voice carries unique authority. As Gallaudet warns, pilots, credible observers, and calibrated military instrumentation have recorded objects accelerating at rates and crossing the air-sea interface in ways not possible for anything made by humans. When voices of this stature sound the alarm, it becomes clear these are not just stories or so-called radar ghosts. The dismissive label skeptics used for decades to wave away impossible returns. The earliest major military investigation of this modern pattern began with the ghost rocket flap over Scandinavia in 1946. Hundreds of elongated, luminous objects appeared over Sweden and Finland. A surprising fraction were observed to impact lakes or the sea, prompting Swedish military divers to search at least one site and recover nothing. The working hypotheses ranged from Soviet test vehicles to meteor fragments, but none explained the repeated entry into water without explosive effects, the guided behavior, or the inability to retrieve fragments in shallow, controlled search areas. The surviving files show a bureaucracy that took the phenomenon seriously in private, while presenting a mundane face in public. This two-track posture would recur for decades. In 1952, NATO assembled a powerful fleet for Operation Mainbrace in the Norwegian Sea. British, Danish, and American personnel recorded multiple disc- and oval-shaped objects, maneuvering near naval aircraft and surface groups. The sightings spanned days, involved trained observers, and included the kind of angular accelerations that do not map to conventional platforms. The British establishment recognized the political risk of admitting that unknowns were pacing a premier exercise. Internally, they opened a deeper review. Publicly, they presented caution and distance. This one event injected a seed into Western defense culture. On water, during the largest exercises, the unknowns appear. If you pull on the Cold War string on the other side of the Atlantic, you land in the Western Atlantic and Caribbean. Reports accumulate along the U.S. East Coast operating areas and across the Bermuda Triangle. The pattern is not celebrity cases but repetition. Unknown lights and solid targets track naval groups, loiter near warning areas, then disappear into or out of the water. Radios cut, compasses drift, radar contacts drop from tens of thousands of feet to wave height in a blink, then are reacquired at altitude again. A minority of cases include the ultimate heresy for aerodynamics. A solid object drops into the ocean with no plume, no shock, and no visible splash, then reappears airborne within seconds, as if the interface between air and water is meaningless. When this is supported by simultaneous radar and visual confirmation, the official response is to open a quiet log, not a press conference. Shag Harbour in Nova Scotia in 1967 is the archetype for the public version of the maritime story. Witnesses saw a glowing object descend and strike the water. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were notified. Search and rescue assets responded. The Royal Canadian Navy conducted dives. Official communiques acknowledged an unidentified object in the water and a fruitless search. Less public follow-up placed naval attention on an underwater track moving along the coast toward a joint Canadian and United States acoustic facility. The formal record ends with a shrug. The pattern lesson is stronger than the single case. Government agencies can acknowledge an object in the water and conduct real operations without ever resolving the identity of the object. In the Pacific, the catalogue thickens. The California Channel Islands and the seafloor around San Clemente and San Nicolas Islands have hosted decades of weapons testing and carrier group workups. The same zones produce dense UAP and USO narratives from military and civilian witnesses. Surface ships report radar tracks that plunge to sea level and vanish. Air crews see smooth, bright objects hovering over water and then depart with impossible acceleration. Fishermen report silent lights moving under the surface at speeds that make submariners laugh and wince at the same time. Sonar technicians talk about fast movers that transit a screen so quickly that doctrine tells them to log it as biological or unknown ambient to avoid career risk. Add the 2004 carrier group off Southern California. The Aegis radar cleans up its filtering and begins to see something it was not supposed to see. Targets appear at stratospheric altitude, drop to the surface, and loiter. Intercepts are flown. A flight lead sees a white oblong with no wings disturbing the water as if something below is boiling the sea. The object reacts to the intercept in a way that is not hostile and not random, then departs. The next rendezvous point is a secret, and the object is already there. The meta pattern is not one video, not one pilot, but systems of different types painting the same impossible kinematics anchored to maritime space. Move forward to the mid-teens on the Atlantic training ranges off Virginia and the Carolinas, and the story repeats. Fleet pilots report daily or weekly contact with objects that sit still in high winds, travel against the wind without obvious propulsion, or race by with no heat signature. The theater is always water. The objects are tracked by fighter radars, and at times by ground or ship sensors. The pilots are angry because nobody cleared the airspace and they nearly hit one. The public fixates on 3 short clips. The pattern that matters is operational tempo, geography, and rules of engagement. Over water, near warning areas, day after day, unknowns appear and are never publicly resolved. As Lieutenant Ryan Graves, a Navy FA-18 pilot with thousands of flight hours, testified before Congress, "These things would be out there all day, keeping station over the water. They were there when we took off, and they were there when we landed." This was not a single fleeting encounter, but a pattern, a constant presence over the ocean, logged by the Navy's most advanced aircraft and sensors. The Southern Hemisphere delivers a similar trace. The Kaikoura lights in New Zealand in 1978 were filmed and tracked by radar while pacing an aircraft over the Cook Strait. Chile operates an official investigative body that has filed multiple unknowns over coastal waters with trained witnesses and instrument support. Brazil has an entire subculture of riverine and coastal luminous object reports that at times entered official channels and even scramble orders. The Antarctic has scattered but persistent reports from scientific parties and naval crews during expeditions and resupply operations. Across these geographies, the interface with the sea recurs. Reports include electromagnetic effects such as magnetometer swings, compasses that spin, and radio blackout as luminous objects transit. If you search for cases where radar, visual, and electromagnetic disturbance co-occur, you find that water is usually involved. Submarines are the hardest thread to pull because the strongest data is buried under classification. There is still enough in the open to state the following without bluster. Long-range fixed hydrophone systems have recorded transients that do not match known propulsion or animal signatures. Tactical sonars have seen targets that appear at high speed and high aspect, then are gone faster than a proficient operator can tag and track. There are accounts of destroyers or frigates rolling depth charges on targets that seem to tease the ship, then depart at speeds that invalidate the purpose of the attack. There are Russian and Soviet-era testimonials from naval officers who thought they were being harassed by something they could not model and were warned not to diarize it. If you exhaust the mundane hypotheses, you are left either with advanced coastal nation craft that outclass everything in the water by a factor that would change naval doctrine, or you are left with a class of visitor that treats water as a place to move and hide with the same ease as air. The popular imagination then jumps to underwater bases. The Malibu anomaly is a totem for this impulse. Sonar and bathymetric images off Point Dume appear to show a domed structure with column-like features. Geologists explain it as a familiar seafloor formation. There is no chain of custody from anomaly image to physical sampling. It remains a hypothesis that tugs at intuition and irritates science. A better disciplined approach is to plot reported transmedium corridors against bathymetry and geology. When you do this, the coincidences pile up. Deep trenches, steep escarpments, and complex ridge zones coincide with repeated unknown traffic. The Puerto Rico Trench and the broader Bermuda Triangle region have this geometry. So do the trench and ridge systems off Japan and the Pacific Northwest. So does the Norwegian Sea, where the shelf falls away quickly. The rational inference is not secret domes, but practical invisibility. Deep water and broken terrain are the best places to enter and exit without being recorded by a surface observer, a coastal radar, or a line-of-sight camera. If an intelligence wants to avoid humans, water is cover and doorway at once. It is tempting to then inflate that sober inference into stronger claims about permanent bases. The present evidence does not carry that weight. What it does support is that the sea is repeatedly used as a medium of transit, a shield against observation, and perhaps as a place to loiter for reasons we do not yet understand. That conclusion survives contact with the best-known debunking themes. Misidentified aircraft and drones can explain some incidents, especially near training ranges. Atmospheric ducts and radar processing artifacts explain some of the kinematics. Whales, large schools of fish, and water column thermal layers can mimic motion on sonar. None of those classes of explanation can carry the full load of multi-sensor events with transmedium behavior at tactically relevant ranges. Those events do not need mythology to remain anomalous. Electromagnetic interference events cluster with water in a way that deserves more attention than it gets. Shutdowns of radios and transponders, compass errors, and localized magnetometer spikes are described by witnesses at sea and on coasts during close approaches. In the archives of the 1950s and 1960s, these effects are written in prose and sidelined as witness color. In later decades, pilots learned to use the language that keeps a career intact. They write that they experienced a momentary loss of situational awareness while sensors reset. The practical effect is the same. Something in a small volume of space near the object rearranges local electromagnetic conditions. If you accept that, then the cases of measured interference at Antarctic stations and along South American coasts become more than folklore. They become instrumentation hints that a real physical process is in play in maritime airspace. A word about whales and strandings belongs here because it is the most controversial cross-current. Mass strandings of deep-diving beaked whales coincide with naval exercises that use powerful mid-frequency active sonar. Scientists have documented hemorrhaging and trauma that implicate sonar as a cause. This is not speculation. It is uncomfortable institutional fact. There are also sporadic mass fish kills and odd coastal die-offs that arrive without clear cause. A responsible synthesis does not throw these into the UAP basket. It notes instead that water is a loud and complicated medium, and that our militaries can and do trigger biological harm at scale. This is precisely the acoustic and electromagnetic fog that a separate intelligence would exploit. An honest investigator asks whether any spikes in maritime UAP reporting correlate with sonar-heavy exercises or with coastal electromagnetic events. In a few windows they do. The correlation does not prove causation in either direction. It does prove that if you want to hide unusual motion in the sea, you pick your moment to overlap human noise. Institutional behavior has been consistent since the earliest files. The 1953 scientific panel that advised the intelligence community recommended a policy of downplaying and debunking, with a specific eye to training credible witnesses to treat the subject as unserious. Aviation and naval communications orders formalized reporting channels for vital intelligence sightings, while warning personnel against public disclosure under penalty. By the 1970s, this had produced a tidy culture. If a pilot or a radar operator wanted to tell the truth, they did it in a quiet after-action report, or they did not do it at all. When modern naval aviators began to speak openly about daily encounters in training ranges, it was not because the phenomenon suddenly arrived. It was because the stigma slackened enough for them to trade risk for safety. The disclosure wave that began in the late 20-teens did not erase the prior 70 years. It admitted that the pattern was never an illusion. There is a philosophical risk in trying to collapse all maritime anomalies into one explanation. The sea is a stage with many actors. Foreign drones and submersibles play there. Classified domestic platforms exercise there. Exotic atmospheric optics and ducting happen there. The ocean is also the best hiding place on Earth for anything that does not want to be seen. The cleanest hypothesis that fits the cross-decades pattern is that more than one class of agent uses the sea as a shield. One class is ours and our adversaries. Another class is an intelligence that is older or simply other. You do not have to decide which single story wins. You simply have to decide whether transmedium behavior has been observed by trained personnel with sensor support in maritime theaters from the 1940s to the present. The answer is yes. The most productive next steps do not require a breakthrough, only discipline. Merge declassified radar tracks with raw acoustic data from fixed arrays for the same windows. Force time synchronization between carrier group logs, pilot debriefs, and shore-based radar tapes. Plot every credible transmedium report against bathymetry, fault lines, and known acoustic shadows. Task unclassified autonomous platforms to sit in those shadows with wideband passive sensors for long dwell. Demand that electromagnetic disturbance reports be treated as primary measurements and not witness garnish. Pull naval communications orders that govern foreign object reporting at sea and in the air and map where cultural suppression still exists. This is how you turn folklore into a data set. If non-human intelligence is using the ocean as a highway or a home, you will catch it more easily in the water column than in the open sky. Speculative hypotheses deserve clear labels. One is the base hypothesis, which posits permanent or semi-permanent engineered structures on or under the seafloor. Evidence for this remains anecdotal or reliant on ambiguous imagery. Another is the indigene hypothesis, which posits an intelligence that predates modern civilization and uses the oceans as an original habitat. This fits myth poorly and physics poorly, but it fits the psychology of human myth-making very well. The least speculative and most dangerous hypothesis is that some unknown actor has mastered boundary layer control or a related field effect that neutralizes drag at the interface of air and water. That model fits the transmedium kinematics cleanly, explains the lack of splash, and would also tend to produce electromagnetic side effects. It also implies a technological maturity that collapses current military assumptions. If you are a planner, you test for this hypothesis first because it has the largest operational consequences. The ocean remains the hinge of this mystery because it is both a sensor blind spot and an engineering solvent. Human platforms treat water and air as different worlds requiring different machines. The unknowns do not. When a pilot says the object fell from high altitude to the surface of the sea like a stone, then sat and frosted the wave tops without disturbance, then left the rendezvous point before it was shared on the radio, he is not describing a drone swarm or a weather balloon. When a radar operator sees a target move the vertical stack in a way that defeats tracking filters, then sees the same behavior weeks later in a different box on the range, he is not describing bugs. When a coastal police unit watches a luminous sphere merge with the surface and split into two submerged lights that continue without splash, they are not describing a trick of salt spray. Run the pattern forward, and the simplest explanation that is still consistent with data is this. There are vehicles that are not ours that use Earth's oceans as if the surface were a formality. We have seen them for 3/4 of a century, and we have chosen not to see them clearly. That choice has protected careers and budgets. It has not protected the truth. Congressman Tim Burchett relayed what he was told directly by a U.S. admiral. They tell me something's moving at hundreds of miles an hour underwater, as large as a football field, underwater. A statement like this, passed from the upper echelons of the military to an elected official, underscores how far beyond ordinary physics these encounters extend, and how much of the record remains hidden from the public. References and sources are consolidated here. The Scandinavian ghost rocket investigations from 1946 are drawn from Swedish Air Force memoranda and later summaries by European aviation historians. Operation Mainbrace sightings in 1952 are attested in Royal Air Force and Royal Navy reports later discussed by United Kingdom and United States investigators and historians of Project Blue Book. The Shag Harbour incident in 1967 is reconstructed from Royal Canadian Mounted Police records, Royal Canadian Navy search and dive logs, and subsequent Canadian archives referenced by Chris Stiles and Don Ledger. United States Navy Carrier Group encounters in 2004, 2015 and 2019 are derived from pilot interviews, debriefing summaries, unclassified Department of Defense acknowledgements, and technical analyses by independent teams. The Aguadilla, Puerto Rico thermal video in 2013 is analyzed in detail by the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies and aligns with eyewitness and sensor data from that night. Kaikoura New Zealand film and radar returns from 1978 are documented by New Zealand civil aviation and defense sources and revisited in later investigative treatments. Chilean coastal incidents are referenced from the official Chilean committee that investigates anomalous aerial phenomena and its public case files. Russian and Soviet naval testimonies regarding unidentified submerged objects have been compiled by researchers, including Vladimir Ajhaja, Paul Stonehill, and Philip Mantle, and appear in interviews and publications that draw on former officer recollections. The electromagnetic interference theme is supported across multiple eras by pilot reports collected by James MacDonald, Brad Sparks, and other investigators, by Antarctic scientific station logs that recorded transient disturbances coincident with aerial phenomena, and by scattered naval and coastal police reports. The policy and suppression record draws on the 1953 Scientific Panel recommendations, United States Communications Instructions for reporting vital intelligence sightings at sea and in the air, and the documented stigma culture within military aviation communities. The biological and acoustic context regarding beaked whale strandings and naval sonar is grounded in published marine biology literature. and after-action inquiries that assign responsibility to mid-frequency active sonar during specific exercises. The broader historical and cross-cultural frame draws on standard works in mythology and anthropology to situate older sea and sky being narratives as cultural echoes rather than evidence.